All right. Well, I've got 6:34, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'm gonna open this up with a prayer. Just something not just relevant to our discussion, but just right now, just a lot of, maybe it's because I've been on Facebook too much the last couple of days, but there's just a whole lot of this going on amongst a lot of folks that I see now. So I'll offer this prayer for peace and social justice that's in our prayer book. The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Let us pray. Grant, O God, that your holy and life-giving Spirit may so move every human heart, especially the hearts of the people of this land, that barriers which divide us may crumble, suspicions disappear, and hatreds cease. That our divisions being healed, we may live in justice and peace. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
All right. So, one thing about this group, as much as we tackle difficult conversations, I think we all are here for the sense not just of being able to bring light to these things, but also for striving to be a group of people as individuals in a group that in every sense. That is something that we keep our eye on even when we get discouraged with other things that are going on around us. So I was going to ask Judy Kidd to share with us a little bit more about the story that she brought up, but she has not joined us yet. My suspicion is she has either forgotten or she is trying to get sick at Canterfield, which is probably the more likely possibility. So let me do one thing, and I will say something at the end too. And this is, there's a couple of people who are normally part of our group who texted me could not be here tonight because of conflicts. We will not meet next week. There's a couple of vestry members on this group who know why. The vestry and I have an appointment with Canon Michelle Bolt to do what's called the Mutual Ministry Review. Something that was written in when I came on board every 6 months into my first 2 years. We do sort of a check-in with the diocese to see how we are with our development goals, which, yes, I've been here for 6 months, which doesn't seem like it in some ways, and in other ways it's not months, that's been it. So, but with COVID and all that stuff, but we will not meet next week. We will be back on in 2 weeks. I'll repeat that at the end for everyone. And that was my one service announcement, and perfect timing because here comes Judy right now. Wait till she gets up here and I'll put her on the spot here. We'll all just say, hey, we were waiting on you.
Hi.
I am going to put you on the spot, but you can do as little with this as you would like. I was going to say before we get into the chapters for tonight, did you want to expand on the story
I haven't
that
been
came
able.
up yesterday or last week? Sorry, last week about the laundromat. Any more details you want to add about that story?
I haven't been able to trace it down. I have a call in from Mary Muir, and I really haven't been able to trace it down. I did talk to Ken and his wife Glenda, who live here at Canterfield, and his shop in Jackson Square, he integrated it in 1966, which was much later than some of this other stuff. But it just goes to show that, yes, we were integrated, but we weren't completely. And so he didn't have too many problems. There were a few people that didn't like what he did, but he finally said to the other people in the union, the haircutter union, he said, well, I'm taking the pressure off you. You won't get any people fussing at you because I'm doing it. He said he wanted to start a shop. He needed the money. He didn't care whose hair he cut. He's a nice guy. So no, I'm sorry, I don't have more information, but
Okay.
you do remember that right after we talked about it, the Oak Ridger had a big article about adopting the Oak Ridge 85, the 85 people who desegregated the schools, and back in 1954. And they've evidently, there was a big article in the paper about it anyway. And I think there are going to be a number of activities to mark the anniversary of that historic event.
Actually, it wasn't plural schools, it was a high school. It
Yeah.
was a number of years before they integrated the elementary school after that.
Yeah, I guess it was just the high
Like
school.
4 or 5 years.
Our daughter integrated early on at Linden. I think she was either first or second grade. So that put
Yeah.
her up quite a bit later. Because she was born
Yeah.
in 66.
I'm sorry. It was in the 60s because I went to Cedar Hill and I remember it well. I think I was probably in 6th grade. So that would have been the late 60s, like 68.
Right, right.
I remember that city council had a declaration for the Oak Ridge 85 at that meeting that Sherry and I were both at a couple of weeks ago about some other topics. But yeah, there'll be some more coming out from what I understand, and that will be something locally that we can engage as far as local history in that regard.
Yeah.
But
I
anyway,
I just wanted to add, I still talk to a girl that was in my class. We're Facebook friends. She doesn't live around here, but Julie Henderson, she's a sweetheart. We still talk fairly regularly on Facebook. So,
all right, so let's dive into the book here. So the chapters for today, which I know which ones they are, just have to look at the numbers, 8, 9, and 10. So 2 of these 3 chapters today were what I call were sort of interlude material in between the one chapter that was about the trial, Walter. And again, kind of same thing we've done last couple of weeks. Just anything that jumps out at you that you want to open up with. I've got things that I can steer us toward, but want to see what thoughts either of any of those chapters that spark something in you.
Well, chapter 8 really, really bothered me. I hadn't realized how many minors were incarcerated for life. And what they did might be very serious, but they were too young to really even know what they were doing. And yet they were there at 13, 14, whatever, for the rest of their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And it really made me weep to read that. And the helplessness of the child and whatever people they had around them. I mean, there just was not any help. Any public defenders or whatever, it was kind of meaningless. It was very troubling. More than that, it was heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Really.
And then the families of those kids could be forced out of town to leave them even less support.
No.
well, and several of them had lived through a living hell before any of this had occurred. You wonder, I don't remember all the specifics and the names, but how some of them survived, just what they had to go through, just getting to that point where they, were in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah.
Or just through, negligence or whatever. They were kids, like the little girl that caught the house on fire. Lord. So it's sad.
It is indeed, Carol. Yeah.
There is some really good stuff online. If you want to take the time to look at it, you can get a lot of facts and figures about how many young people are in jail better than it used to be. There are very few really young people in the jail, but there's an awful lot of them between 25 and 45 that are in there, who's not that many real young ones. But the one thing that bothers me is that if they get arrested, they stick them in jail before, before their trial. So it's that same kind of thing that we saw in this story, where they were put someplace, were scared them to death. And the other thing that I read today is there's about a 78% recidivism. In other words, once you've been in jail once, chances are 70-some% you're going to go back, or you're going to be arrested again. You may not go to jail, but of course, each time you do something, maybe it gets a little longer, and then eventually they can say, well, you're long term, we're going to keep you in here forever.
Well, and this is just speculating on my part, but you wonder if the mentality back then, I don't know what it is now on it, hopefully it's not as bad, but is that, well, let's just put them in jail so we don't have to deal with them at all. And if we can find something, really good to leave them there, let's do it. I mean, I don't think it took a whole lot of thinking to react the way they did, because, I mean, a lot of what they did was full of lies, and they couldn't really back it up as far as the people putting them in jail or prison. And they just wanted them in there. It was like there were no ifs, ands, or buts. And how many people could we get to stand behind us on this action?
I think two things that really bothered me. I mean, there are many things that bothered me, but the solitary confinement, which was used supposedly for protection of a vulnerable person, which then became far more damaging. I mean, it just horrific, this solitary confinement. And the other thing is the scars that are left, can be left on a person through the foster care system. And I know someone who has adopted I guess it would be a grandnephew whose father is in prison. And this, before they were able to get their own kin, this child had been by the age of 2.5, had been at 3 different foster care homes and manipulated. I mean, it's just, this is in Tennessee, East Tennessee. And you think, what are the long-term injuries to the person's spirit when they go through this sort of a thing? I find that just immensely heartbreaking.
Yes, Cameron? Did you have something to say?
I didn't. I didn't. I was just thinking.
But the one who spent 13 years in isolation, that opening poem was written by him. He was bright, and basically, he educated himself in prison while in isolation. And I think
what a great poem that was.
Uncried Tears. And I think Uncried Tears is absolutely superb. And when I realized that that was the same child, and I thought, what a loss, what a great loss. But maybe he wouldn't done that if he hadn't been there. That somehow being isolated forced him to his own resources. We'll never know.
I'm not sure where I heard this, but at some point in time, I heard something to the effect that cultures can be and will be judged by how they treat their children. And I think we've been compared to some Scandinavian cultures where there is leave time for pregnancies and leave times for new fathers, and that the children are valued, and a lot of the civil decisions are made in terms of the impact on the child. Perhaps America is found wanting, but perhaps that is a direction and a way to evaluate decisions. How is this going to impact the children?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One size doesn't fit all, that's for sure.
No, it doesn't.
Most of the kids that get arrested are arrested for what we would think are very simple things. Oh, they're stealing. Well, if you're hungry, you steal. It's just and when they go back into prison, it's for stealing. It's for not showing up for their talking to whoever the person they're supposed to talk to. Let's see. I mean, the things that, in other words, if they had somebody when they first got out who was maybe mentor them and help them, because they're really very minor things that they're doing that make them go back.
Well,
Let Jim Rousey jump in because he was there.
Sorry.
Then Connie.
Oh, I'm sorry. I wanted to follow up on what Connie had said. I'm looking at an NPR article from 2011 where a Pennsylvania judge was sentenced to 28 years in prison because he was getting kickbacks from private juvenile detention centers. And ultimately, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court tossed 4,000 convictions out. So the book, we kind of think of, well, things go a little bit different in some of our southern states, but here, just as Connie said, there were people that were making money off of putting kids in jail. Awful.
I was just thinking when the speaker before Jim spoke, and growing up here in Oak Ridge, and I worked with a lot of different kids from the Boys Club, the Girls Inc., to the schools, but knowing their families as well as you do when you live in a community this small, their uncles, their grandfathers. I mean, a lot of these kids were raised around their relatives going to prison, and they really could not see a way out unless they played sports, or some special person, took them in and really tried to help them. Now, I'm not saying they should be able to do whatever they want to because of that, but I saw a lot of this, and I think I saw it more when my daughter was growing up. She's almost 25 now, but a lot of her friends, I mean, they played sports, but once the sports ended, if they didn't get a scholarship, which most of them don't, and well, people make, some of these kids really did get used for the sports as far as not getting a lot of help with school, but you're good at sports, so just keep playing.
Yeah.
And so that occurred, but, you know, they really just couldn't figure it out. And, you know, it was hard to see it. You know, my daughter had a friend in high school. She's like so loving, and but this guy's in prison right now, and she still talks to him. They write letters, and I'm like, what? But you know, she doesn't like him, but you know, she has empathy, and I'm blessed that she does, but it's sad that this happens a lot today. You know, I'm not the exception, I'm sure. Aaron and Aaron's dad and myself are very compassionate people, and we care about people, but and maybe that's where she got it from, but you know, there's no Band-Aid we can put on all of it. And I mean, we all play a part, whatever that part is. So that's why I was glad that we started this, because it can help me. You know, I've had all these thoughts in my head for years, and it can kind of help me muddle through it and figure out what I can do to help. You know, I don't know what that is, but anyway, I'm really enjoying this class. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Connie.
I think a lot of the long-term sentence, the mandatory sentencing guidelines came out of the 80s and 90s during the time when crime seemed to be rising very dramatically. The philosophy of 3 strikes and you're out. And some of you may be more familiar with that, with the laws of that time, but the legislatures, state and federal, were responding to what they perceived to be the public, you know, what we wanted, what the public wanted. It's sometimes convenient to simply point and say, well, you know, they were, you know, the system is broken. Well, the system reflected what people in the 80s and 90s were, you know, the fear that many of us had, the middle class of the rise in crime.
I was just reading about the fact that at that time,
Yes.
there were many social psychologists who were talking about super predators coming out. And they put fear. That was it, a lot of fear. And actually, this was in the New York Times today. It never developed. It's easy to say, well, they put them all in the jail, but it wasn't that. It just didn't happen. And actually, it's very sad because an awful lot of people got scooped in for very, very long terms for things that just really, that kind of punishment was not called for.
Yeah, and I found it disturbing that when those super predator laws were changed, they didn't automatically go back and revisit the sentences of those who had been incarcerated under those draconian laws. So they're stuck there, but some of the younger kids who then were incarcerated had completely different sentences. So to me, that was really horrible. I mean, you find out new information.
Well, I think they have
you should be able to apply it back.
Some places.
Well, state by state, this is part of the issue of states' rights. There's so many differences from one state to another.
Yeah,
You
go
know,
back
I
to
think another aspect of the incarceration rates and the way people are treated may have to do with some years ago, you know, we heard a lot on the news and from people that we know about how absolutely impossible it was for the police to deal with anyone at first that was on crack cocaine, because they had no pain, would experience no pain, and were, you know, they were super people for that instant that they were being arrested. And then later it was methamphetamines. And I heard some advice from a supervisor that I was going to have in Morgan County. I did have in Morgan County, and we went to a pretty graphic, I would say, little short training session on these kinds of situation, drug use, particularly methamphetamine. And I would just wonder, some of this that you see on the news, that we see on the news even now, with the way people are arrested and they just are overpowered and not given a single chance. And I think maybe there's quite a bit of fear on the part of the police officers that if they don't react very, very strongly, that the persons are going to be able to overcome them. And so other persons, I think in the first place a lot of that is proved to be false. But other persons that the police may encounter are all subject to that kind of thinking, maybe. I'm not an expert at this. I just listen to things that I hear people talk about and see on the news. But it's just a conjecture on my part. I was stopped one time when I was driving my older pickup truck, and in by mistake, I was on Sugar Grove Valley Road, and I was fixing to go over Center's Bridge. And I pulled over, and nothing happened. You know, I couldn't see any sign of a police officer behind me. It was a sheriff. And I didn't know where the guy was. And there was some period of time when I didn't know what was going on. And then I looked in my rearview mirror, and there he was, clinging to the side of my truck with his sidearm drawn and sneaking up on me, you know, like he was fully expecting there to be a very violent encounter. Of course, all of that just kind of went away like smoke when he realized that he wasn't dealing with one of these, whoever it was he was expecting. But he was looking for my truck. I mean, he was looking for a truck that looked like mine. And I mean, this guy he was afraid. And he was gonna shoot first. So I
Why,
don't know. I'm just saying that it's kind of interesting that that kind of stuff is allowed to grow up, and I wonder how much of that is involved in the police, and maybe police and other law enforcement people can be somewhat retrained.
I'd like to speak on that. I think, well, I know, because I've had a lot of experience with people that have to deal with fears a lot, and they do deal with them because it's part of their program. But all this is driven by fear. And right now, because of the COVID, people's fears are accentuated. I mean, I even read an article, and I can't remember where it was, but about the fact that any problem, medical, physical, or medical, mental, right now is going to be accentuated because everyone is stressed out, and likely so. And I do think they need some kind of a training. It'd be great if every policeman and every person right now could have a therapist, but you know, that's in a you know, la la land thinking, I think. But in you know, policemen have to react quickly sometimes. But I think right now they don't know when they need to act quickly and when they need to ease up. I mean, if all they're hearing about on TV right now is people getting shot or you're getting shot at or whatever, they're not going to react calmly. I think it needs to start somewhere. I don't think there's going to be an easy answer considering the climate right now. But yeah, I think something has to be, you know, looked at to help that situation.
Yeah.
And we, getting back to the book,
Yeah.
the police, is Judy wanting to say something?
Judy, are you saying something, dear? I guess not.
Anyway, back to the book and the policeman's response there. I think that's different from what's going on now. And I found the last chapter we looked at about Avery's case and the very mean Confederate prison warden, I thought that was a story of redemption, where the mean, I'm just for shorthand calling him the mean guard, heard how much of a horrible life that Avery had had as, you know, I know what to call it, it just went out of my head, foster care, and how he utterly changed when it brought memories to himself about his bad time in foster care. And it just goes to show how deeply people who are injured somehow in the past can become abusers. And then, you know, he had that moment of epiphany, I think, in the courtroom. I mean, I thought that chapter was brilliant and surprising. You never know when someone will have the light bulb turn on and be very different, and you see something about them you didn't even know was there.
I love that story about the chocolate milkshakes. Wonderful story. I just moved to a better place.
Let me kind of kick us into that last chapter. Yeah, let me kind of, with Gay Marie bringing that up, let me kind of kick us into that last chapter since we've got about 20 minutes left. Everything's been very good discussion, but the chapter 8 deals with juvenile issues, which I really need to get my mom to do a conversation with us at some point, because there's so much of her knowledge in juvenile court that she can share, even though she's been out of it for about 8 years now. But now this last chapter, chapter 10, and we haven't even gotten into 9, which is the continuation of the McMillan trial, and we can bring that up next time. But the issue with mental illness, I can tell you as a priest, I can tell you in some other service industries that I have been in before, where I had to deal on a regular basis with people that had very severe mental illness. What he makes the point, there was a line in there, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but he says, the accommodations we make for the physically disabled, we don't make them do things. They're missing a leg, or if they've had a severe accident with spinal injury, we make accommodations. But someone with a mental illness, we even with all of our advances in psychiatry and in the study of the brain, we really don't still know what to do with mental illness. Certainly, the justice system, as evidenced in this book, and I believe with my own experience that this is the rule rather than the exception of what he portrays. We still just have no idea what to do with mental illness. I can tell you the church sometimes have an idea of what to do with mental illness. And I'll give you an example. Somebody, and I'm not going to mention this person's name, and this is a person who was not mischievous. There was nothing wrong with this person was doing. But this is a person that was here at St. Stephen's during my first stint. She has since passed away. A number of you are going to figure out who I'm talking about, but she walked around and legitimately believed she was married to notable figures, one of whom was Prince Charles. And at one point, she had booked a flight to go to London.
I remember, yes.
And
yes.
Those of you who know this, know this story, to go to Buckingham Palace, and her idea was she would knock on the door and present herself to Prince Charles. And the story would be funny, except for the fact that was real for her. And it was, and I left about that time that all that happened. What little I heard of the story afterwards, at some point, I know her daughter finally had to put her into a hospital somewhere, but
Yes.
it was always a struggle.
Her as an EV.
Yeah.
in hospital.
I would imagine some of y'all EVs probably did go to visit her at some point. But the point of it is it was always uncomfortable to be around her, because you never knew how to act. You never knew what she was going to say. And part of that is expected, but part of that too is it would not be uncommon to see people sort of turn the other way and walk away when it's coming across. They just didn't know what to deal with her. Imagine that from the justice system, where people just, you can't turn away and just ignore people. You just treat them, as somebody said earlier, just treat everybody the same, instead of, no, everybody needs to be dealt with for whatever their context is, which is a very hard thing to do. So just talk about your reflections, and Gay Marie's already talked about that wonderful story of the prison guard, and redemption. I think is a perfect word for that, Gay Marie. Other reflections about that chapter, your thoughts about mental illness and how we, this goes from dealing with racial issues to dealing with people who struggle with mental illness, which I would imagine there's at least one or two of us in this group who have struggled or are struggling with the mental illness that we probably either medicate or cover up very well. But how many people out there don't have access to the kind of treatment that we are able to get? And how do we look at it as the mission field? How do we show compassion and exercise justice for these folks out there?
Well, there was Elaine. Elaine used to turn up at the healing service on Wednesday nights sometimes.
And she's still around, by the way.
Is she?
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad, because I haven't seen her in quite a while.
I talked to her not too long ago.
And she turned up at 9 o'clock service, and she really wanted to have her feet washed by David. And it wasn't appropriate, of course. So he had to divert her. So she came to me and she wanted me to dance with her. So I did. But I'd had hip surgery, so I really couldn't do anything. All I could do was just kind of hold her hands and bounce. I was sitting back in the corner. And she was content with that. And she complained. She said, people around here don't give me their names, but I tell them who I am. And I thought, yeah, I think that's probably it. We aren't really sure we want to have a lane. We used to take taxis to the church. Don't want her to look us up. She was bright enough, you know. Take a taxi to my house. So yes, I did discriminate against her. And she was a gentle soul. And she lived in Massachusetts for a while. She recognized I was from there. That's my little, one of my failings there. But it was hard to know how to interact with her.
You know, we talk about training that the policemen need, but I think many of us aren't trained. We haven't learned the language of how to respond to those kinds of things. Mary Ellen, I mean, I think many times I've thought about it in terms of interviewing and different things. You learn a specialized language. Even when English is your first language, there's still certain constructions you use in certain situations. And I know I don't have a background in how to talk about feelings to begin with, just because of my family background. So how do you deal with people who have a mental disability? I think a lot of us could do with some training.
Can I add a little bit?
Absolutely.
You know, our family's kind of walking this in a way, not in terms of justice and mercy, not yet, but, you know, I have two children that are on, two grandchildren that are on the spectrum, and I really appreciate your bringing up the idea that people don't know what to do. They don't know how to deal with it. They don't know how to respond and everything. Because if River's out and he's nonverbal and he's flapping his hands in front of his face and all, people just like, ooh, and other children don't know how to respond. And the good news is that the individuals that do take the time, and I'm not criticizing, but I'm just saying, as we meet these people, that gives us an opportunity to learn and to ask questions about, you know, the best way to respond or how we can respond. So I think this is a good lesson, and I appreciate you bringing that up. That for myself, you know, when I meet somebody and I don't know exactly how to respond to them, then I need to stop and think, okay, then I need to learn, you know, how to respond and where, you know, how can I learn that? And if this is somebody that I'm going to be seeing regularly, and I you know, that kind of information is out there. You know, I know lots of people that would be more than happy to talk to you about autism and how to respond to autism. I had tons of people to line up for that one. So, but anyway, it just struck me, well, golly bum, you know, we live that with River and Mabel all the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think mental illness is it's a broad brush, and it covers things from behaviors that really, depression and anxiety, which, an enormous proportion of the general public at some point experiences, to very delusional behavior, to schizophrenia, and we just kind of lump them all together. Some kinds of behavior, while a little unusual, are not problematic. Others, it's natural to pull back, and sometimes healthy to maintain some pretty clear boundaries. So it's hard to generalize too much.
Is that one size does not fit all statement again. And general rule of thumb that I have, both as a priest and just my interactions with human beings in general, is I don't know, unless I know the person really, really well, and even then I don't know everything, but I don't know anything of the person's story that I'm talking to, and kind of follow with what Sherry said. Part of my job is just to listen and learn, and above all else, remember the baptismal covenant. Strive to respect the dignity of every human being in whatever possible way that is. Sometimes it's, sometimes you can't get them a milkshake. That's all that they want. But you can give them yourself. Right. With, as Steve noted, figuring out where appropriate boundaries are in that is very important. But at the same time, you can offer yourself. If nothing else. We tend to have, and I think this goes to the heart of all these issues we're discussing, we tend to rush to judgment toward things we do not understand, and to decide we tend to decide this is what needs to be done and how we are supposed to interact with this person, and then we apply it across the board because that's the easy thing to do. And I can certainly tell you, in church work for me, it ain't the case. It does not work that way. But I think that's a reflective of life in general. And Sherry, your observation is wonderful. And yeah, dealing with your grandchildren, dealing with autistic children and adults, you're used to that. The majority of us here would have no idea. We would have no idea what to do for the most part, because most of us here probably don't have much experience. And it's like I said, it's a learning experience. Any other thoughts on this chapter? A couple of thoughts I want to wrap us up with, and we've still got a few minutes, but any other reflections on any of this, not just chapter 10?
Well, one of the things that I learned today is that that we are incarcerating young people a lot less than we used to. The numbers are down 60 or 70% than what they were 20 years ago, and they're finding other ways to treat them, and other ways of doing some sort of
Interventions,
intervention or whatever with them. And they've also, part of that has come from the fact that they have learned about the human brain, especially male human brains, that unfortunately, you guys don't learn exactly right and wrong, and you will do things that are dangerous. And it takes to almost 24, 25 for some of you to understand that you can't jump off buildings and not get hurt. And there's been a lot of scientific studies of that, about it, and people are realizing that these kids do dumb things because their brains haven't matured. Which brings me to the fact that last night or this morning, I saw a picture on television of this very nice looking blonde boy in Kenosha who had a gun, and he looked like he was about 16. It turns out he was 17. And he has been arrested for killing several people in Kenosha. And it just broke my heart because he was a really cute looking kid. If you'd just seen him walking down the street, you said, typical, nice teenage kid. He's got a mama and a daddy and a grandma and somewhere. And here's this kid. What's going to happen to him?
Well,
And he simply didn't have the maturity to realize that he couldn't do what he was doing. And he'd been brainwashed probably by some group or whatever. He belonged to some militia group. And I thought, what can you do about that? It's a form of mental illness too, to think that you can go and do what he did.
and I think that situation shows the disparity in the treatment of blacks and whites, because the man who was shot in the back 7 times was not a danger. This kid with his gun killed 2 people, seriously injured another, and there apparently is some video that shows the police told the kid to go home.
He's white, yes.
It's a very different situation.
Yep.
Very different treatment. And that's the problem. And that's what's been happening long before the pandemic.
Well, maybe people will get, they'll get attention paid to what's going on when there's no basketball games tonight.
Yeah.
Because all the basketball players have refused to play.
Well, let me bring up one final comment, and this may be a jumping off point for next time. 2 things before I say this final point. Again, a reminder for those of you who jumped in late, we will not meet next week because of a vestry meeting that we've got next Wednesday at this time. So we'll be back with this in 2 weeks. Our homework for the next times to read 11, 12, and 13 will be our topics to talk about. I'm going to open up this can of worms as we go to the very end. Really, I'm trying not to make it a can of worms, but one thing, and there was I know the Oak Ridge Ministerial Association had a wonderful meeting yesterday that unfortunately I could not attend, that was dealing with not this particular issue, but dealing with some things along the realm of things we've been talking about today. But one of my colleagues in the Ministerial Association and I were talking very recently about some things we've seen on Facebook. And of course, I think everybody's aware of this term defunding the police, which has come out, and it's a term which has become such a political charge. You're either, basically the responses are twofold. Either, this is a horrible thing to do, it's just a bunch of people are trying to destroy America on the one end, or we need to get rid of all the police because they're just bad and evil people. And I subscribe to neither one of those by any stretch of the imagination. But I say this because this conversation I know is happening in some quarters here in Oak Ridge with the Oak Ridge Police and with local community leaders, including some clergy. And I say all of what we've talked about tonight, this whole idea of, one size does not fit all. What are the resources that we have in order to deal with the varying issues that people who run afoul of the law that they are dealing with, whether that's coming from poverty, racial issues, mental health issues, all of those things. I think the conversation is a good one in the sense it's not, most of the people, in fact, all the people I know who to take a fairly reasonable position are not trying to get rid of police. Everybody that I know recognizes the police have a very essential role, and properly trained police are an essential part of our society. What the discussion is how do we train police officers, but also how do we provide access and training to other services to help deal with, say, the people who, the guy who had the car accident, can't remember his name off the top of my head, and was talking to himself and, wound up basically eating his own waste while he was in prison because he had gotten that bad. And how do you deal with those kind of matters and with people who are struggling with issues like that. And so I think, out of this discussion, once we're finished in a few weeks, I'm going to pose a question to you is what's the next step, not just for this group, what's the next step for us, parish, to take as far as how we engage the community on these plethora of issues that we've been discussing. I mentioned the laundry glove thing last week, which a couple of you wrote back to me and said you loved the idea. But I do think for those of you, especially who are already engaged in some civic discourse, whether you're with Rotary or another civic group, you've been working with city council, you've been doing stuff and you're connected with other people, you're going to be hearing these conversations, I'm pretty sure, if you haven't already, coming up in our community. And I would ask you is what should the justice system in Oak Ridge look like? I mean, what are the issues in our justice system here locally? We can talk about this on a grandiose scale, but let's start here locally in Oak Ridge, Anderson County, or the other communities in which we live, because some of you obviously are not in Oak Ridge. How are we as a church to, I wouldn't even say have an impact, but to be a participatory and influential part of those conversations? I'm not asking for an answer to that now. I'm just asking for y'all to think about what our presence in the community in those terms look like. So that's actually, besides the reading, it's your homework assignment. It's to think about that. What does it look like for us to be involved in matters of taking care of the least and the marginalized, which some of you already are doing or have been doing in many and sundry ways. And some of you, like Liz, for instance, with her work for all those years in ADFAC, have an expertise that goes well beyond what I have. Sherry working with those who are in the autism community. You got probably very different pots of people here. But what does it look like for this church, this community, to have a participatory role in community life of Oak Ridge and our surrounding areas? So that's what I leave you with as something to think about and pray about, because I think that's, to me, I'm very passionate about our faith has to take action in some way. And what's that look like? And I just offer that as something for you to think about and to dwell about, and we'll have opportunities to discuss that. Any other final comments before we log off?
I really enjoy this group. I'm so glad to see you there, everybody. It's great.
Good to see everyone too.
Hi, Jim.
So,
Thank you all.
thank you all. Good to see everyone.
Have a good night.
All right. Good night, everyone.